They said it was just a small fee, but when I refused to bow down to the HOA's ridiculous demands, they didn't just fine me, they came for something far more valuable. Overnight, my pride and joy was destroyed in front of the entire community. And the worst part, they claimed it was all within their rights. Imagine standing powerless as everything you've worked for is ripped away, not because of the law, but because of a petty board hungry for control. What would you do if the people meant to protect your neighborhood turned into its biggest threat?
For years, life in the Marina community felt like a dream. Tucked away on the coast, it wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a lifestyle. Families gathered for evening walks along the docks, children rode their bikes past rows of boats, and neighbors exchanged polite smiles as they watered their flowers or carried groceries home. At the heart of it all sat one of the Marina's most admired residents, Daniel. A successful business owner who had worked tirelessly for decades, his greatest joy wasn't in showing off his wealth, but in spending time on the water. His yacht, sleek and white against the horizon, wasn't just a vessel, it was his sanctuary.
Daniel wasn't a troublemaker, and he wasn't flashy. He paid his dues, kept his property immaculate, and made sure his presence enriched the community rather than disturbed it. For many, he represented what Marina living was supposed to be: peaceful, balanced, and free. Yet beneath that polished surface of calm waters and neighborly smiles, the HOA board was tightening its grip. The Homeowners Association wasn't just enforcing rules about landscaping or quiet hours. Over time, they had grown more aggressive, targeting small infractions and turning them into opportunities for fines. A garden hose left out overnight, a boat cover not perfectly aligned. Even the length of time someone parked near the dock seemed to attract letters from the board. At first, Daniel brushed it off as minor annoyances. Every community had its politics, and he wasn't the type to stir the pot. But whispers began circulating about the HOA's new president, a woman determined to raise standards and protect property values, even if it meant going after longtime residents. Those who challenged her quickly found themselves buried under citations and escalating fees. It didn't take long for Daniel's yacht, his most prized possession, to catch their attention. What began as subtle hints in monthly newsletters soon turned into pointed reminders. All vessels must comply with HOA guidelines regarding appearance and maintenance. It sounded harmless, but Daniel knew better. He could feel the board's eyes on him every time he walked down the dock. His spotless record, his respected place in the community, and even the yacht itself seemed to be painting a target on his back. And as Daniel would soon discover, the HOA wasn't just willing to push the boundaries of fairness. They were prepared to destroy everything he held dear in order to prove a point. At first, Daniel thought the letters were just warnings, a notice about a paint discoloration on the side of his yacht, a reminder that dock aesthetics needed to be consistent across the marina, a suggestion that his boat exceeded acceptable length for the assigned slip. Each message arrived on crisp HOA letterhead, tucked into his mailbox with the cold authority of bureaucracy. He read them, sighed, and set them aside. After all, his yacht was in perfect condition, polished, inspected, and maintained better than most in the harbor. These complaints felt less like genuine concerns and more like a campaign to unsettle him. But the notices didn't stop. They multiplied. By the third month, Daniel was receiving them weekly. Small infractions turned into violations. Each violation came with a fine, some as low as $50, others in the hundreds. The strangest part? No one else seemed to be receiving them. The dock beside him housed a yacht with peeling paint and frayed ropes, but no letters appeared in that owner's mailbox. Another slip down, a boat sat idle with algae growing along its hull. Still, silence from the HOA. It became obvious Daniel was being targeted. He tried to reason with the board. He attended one of their monthly meetings, a simple gathering in the clubhouse where residents sat in folding chairs while the board members perched behind a long table. When it came time for open discussion, Daniel calmly presented his case. His yacht was compliant with all written rules, he had documentation from Marina inspectors, and the repeated notices were not only unnecessary, but bordering on harassment. The board listened, stone-faced. The president, Marissa, leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She thanked Daniel for his concerns and promised the board would review the situation. But as Daniel returned to his seat, he could feel the smirk of victory radiating from her. That night, another notice arrived, this time claiming his yacht posed a safety hazard because it blocked visibility along the dock. It was laughable. But the laughter didn't last. Each notice came with an attached deadline. Pay the fine within 30 days or face further action. At first, Daniel paid a few just to avoid confrontation. But the more he paid, the more they demanded. It was a cycle, one designed to break him down. And then, the harassment spread beyond paperwork. One morning, Daniel arrived at the dock to find a bright orange sticker slapped across his yacht's hull, "Property in violation." The sticker was large, adhesive, and difficult to peel off without scratching the paint. Neighbors walking by slowed down, whispering to each other, casting sideways glances. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't just a resident, he was being marked as a rule breaker, publicly shamed in his own community. The stress mounted. His mailbox filled with letters, his phone buzzed with automated reminders about unpaid fines. Some were laughably fabricated. Excessive noise when his yacht hadn't even left the dock. Failure to maintain landscaping when he didn't own a single patch of grass. Daniel began keeping a folder, thick with copies of every notice, every receipt, every absurd accusation. But the board wasn't finished. They began to escalate their threats. Failure to comply may result in suspension of Marina access. Continued violations may lead to removal of property at owner's expense. Daniel couldn't believe it. Remove his yacht? The very idea was outrageous. He had paid for his slip, owned his boat outright, and maintained it better than anyone else. Yet the tone of the letters made it sound inevitable, as if the decision had already been made. One sleepless night, Daniel sat at his desk, surrounded by papers, reading the HOA bylaws line by line. Buried deep in the dense language was a clause. The board had the authority to maintain community standards and take corrective action if property is deemed in violation after due notice. It was vague, almost intentionally so, but Daniel realized what it meant. With enough citations and enough so-called violations, the board could justify drastic action. And then came the breaking point. On a quiet morning, as Daniel sipped coffee on his porch, he heard a sound that made his stomach drop. Heavy machinery. He rushed down the dock, heart pounding. And there it was. A crane and a demolition crew standing beside his yacht. The orange sticker had returned, this time plastered across the cabin door, but now it bore a new message: removal order issued. Daniel shouted, demanding to know what they were doing. The crew handed him paperwork stamped with the HOA's seal. According to the board, his yacht had been abandoned and deemed unsafe, and they had authorization to remove it. Neighbors gathered on balconies and sidewalks, phones in hand, recording every moment. Some looked horrified, others curious, but no one intervened. The workers tightened their harnesses and chains, preparing to haul the yacht out of the water. Daniel stood frozen, watching as the boat he had poured his life into, the one place that had always given him peace, dangled on the edge of destruction. He tried calling the police, but they brushed it off as a civil matter. He called his lawyer,
who promised to look into it, but by then the crane was already lifting. The sound of cracking wood and grinding metal filled the marina as Daniel's sanctuary was wrenched from the water. He shouted until his voice broke, waving the stack of receipts and inspections he had collected, but no one listened. The HOA stood at the edge of the dock, arms folded, their faces calm and expressionless, as if watching a show they had orchestrated from the beginning. And just like that, the unthinkable happened. The yacht was demolished. Pieces of fiberglass and splintered railings scattered across the dock. The water rippled with debris. Daniel felt as though years of his life had been torn apart in an instant, not because of neglect or failure, but because of spite. But the board had made one mistake. As Daniel stood amidst the wreckage, clutching his folder of documents, he realized something crucial. The HOA might have thought they held all the power, but they had crossed a line, one that would unleash consequences they could never have imagined. And while they believed they had won, Daniel knew the real battle was only just beginning.
The days after the demolition were a blur of disbelief and fury. Daniel walked the marina like a ghost, his slip empty, the water still rippling with memories of what once floated there. Every time he passed neighbors, he could feel their stares, some sympathetic, some pitying, others just curious to see how long he would last before moving out. The HOA president, Marissa, barely acknowledged him. When she did, it was with the same icy smile, as if daring him to fight back. But Daniel wasn't broken. He was seething, and that anger hardened into something stronger: resolve. He had spent weeks collecting every notice, every photo, every shred of evidence the HOA had thrown at him. Now, with the wreckage of his yacht fresh in his mind, he turned his attention to something they hadn't expected: exposure. The first step was legal. Daniel's lawyer, Carter, initially warned him that HOA cases were notoriously difficult. The bylaws were vague by design, written to give the board broad authority while shielding them from liability. But Daniel insisted. He handed over his binder, thick with documents, pointing out inconsistencies, fabricated fines, and especially the abandonment claim. His yacht, he argued, had been fully maintained, regularly inspected, and not only seaworthy, but insured. To call it unsafe was fraudulent. Carter raised an eyebrow. Fraud, that was a word courts understood. Together, they filed a lawsuit not just for damages, but for malicious intent. And then, Daniel did something even bolder. He went public. Within days, a local news station picked up the story. Cameras rolled as Daniel stood at the empty slip, holding up a photo of his yacht before the demolition. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with barely controlled rage. He spoke about how an HOA meant to protect property values had destroyed his property without lawful justification. He described the harassment, the bogus fines, the humiliation. He called it what it was: abuse of power. The footage spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had stayed silent now stepped forward with their own stories. Fines for lawn chairs left out overnight, threats over holiday decorations, notices about children's toys left in driveways. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't just a man fighting for his yacht. He was the face of a movement. The board panicked. Marissa called an emergency meeting, but it backfired. Residents packed the clubhouse, voices raised in anger. One after another, people stood up to share how the HOA had bullied them. Daniel sat quietly in the back, listening, watching the tide turn. For the first time, the board wasn't in control. But the true climax came in court. On the day of the hearing, Daniel walked into the courthouse with Carter by his side and a folder clutched in his hands.
Across the aisle sat Marissa and the other board members, dressed in suits, their expressions smug and dismissive. They believed the bylaws would protect them, that their vague language and authority to act clauses would shield them from accountability. But what they didn't expect was the evidence Daniel had unearthed. Carter presented inspection reports proving the yacht was safe and fully compliant. He produced photos showing other boats in disrepair, none of which had been cited. He laid out a timeline of letters and fines that escalated without basis. And then, the final blow, an email. It had been leaked by a disgruntled former board member. In it, Marissa wrote to the rest of the board, "Daniel thinks he's untouchable because of that yacht. We need to make an example out of him. If he won't pay the fines, we'll force his hand another way." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's eyebrows shot up. Even the opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Marissa's face drained of color. Carter didn't waste a second. He argued that the demolition wasn't just a misinterpretation of bylaws, it was a targeted act of malice. He demanded not only restitution for the yacht, but punitive damages for emotional distress and defamation. The HOA's defense crumbled. Their lawyer stammered about community standards and collective decisions, but the judge wasn't buying it. The email had revealed intent, and intent made all the difference. As the hearing concluded, the judge announced a preliminary ruling that the HOA had acted outside the bounds of reasonable authority. A full trial would determine damages, but the court ordered an immediate injunction stripping the board of enforcement power until the matter was resolved. It was a stunning blow. For the first time, the board wasn't feared, they were exposed.
Daniel walked out of the courthouse to a crowd of reporters and residents cheering his name. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. Instead, he held up the photo of his demolished yacht and said, "This wasn't just about a boat. This was about standing up when people in power believe they can destroy your life without consequence. They thought they could silence me. Instead, they proved why we need to fight back." Marissa slipped out the side door, her once commanding presence reduced to a hushed figure avoiding eye contact. The board scattered, their unity shattered, their reputation in ruins. But for Daniel, the battle wasn't over. The court had given him a foothold, but the fight for justice and for real accountability had only just begun. The weeks after the court's ruling felt like a storm slowly breaking apart. For years, the HOA board had operated unchecked, their decisions carried out with absolute authority, their notices and fines obeyed without question. But now, their power had been clipped, and everyone in the marina could feel the shift. At first, there was silence, a strange calm in the community. No more letters arriving in mailboxes, no more bright orange violation stickers slapped across doors or boats. People stepped outside more freely. Holiday decorations popped up without fear of penalty, and neighbors began talking openly about what they wanted: lower fees, reasonable rules, and a community built on trust rather than intimidation. Daniel, though, wasn't celebrating yet. He had won the first battle, but the war for accountability was far from over. His yacht was gone, reduced to scraps and splinters, and no ruling could undo that loss. But what the HOA didn't realize was in trying to destroy him, they had given him something they couldn't take away: undeniable proof of corruption.
The trial moved forward, and this time the courtroom was packed, not just with reporters and curious outsiders, but with residents, dozens of them, who had their own stories to tell. One man described being fined for the color of his curtains. A family recounted how they were threatened with eviction over their children's toys left outside. Another elderly couple shared how they had been intimidated into paying thousands of dollars in maintenance fees that never seemed to lead to any actual maintenance. Piece by piece, the pattern emerged. It wasn't just Daniel. The HOA had been using its authority like a weapon, preying on residents through fear and manipulation, and the jury saw it clearly. When the verdict came, it landed like a hammer. The HOA was guilty of malicious intent, abuse of power, and fraudulent practices. Daniel was awarded not just the full value of his yacht, but additional punitive damages. The sum was staggering, enough to cripple the HOA's budget and send shockwaves through the entire board. The news spread fast. Headlines blared, "Homeowner defeats HOA in landmark case," and community board found guilty of abuse of power. For weeks, Daniel's story dominated local coverage, and even national outlets picked it up as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority. He became more than just a victim. He became a symbol. But the fallout didn't stop with the verdict. Marissa, once the iron-fisted president of the HOA, resigned in disgrace. Her allies on the board scattered, some stepping down quietly, others forced out by furious residents. In their place, a new committee was elected, one that pledged transparency, fairness, and community input. Where once meetings were closed-door affairs, now they were open, lively, and filled with voices demanding accountability. The residents themselves changed too. They were no longer afraid. People who had once whispered in private now spoke openly about what they wanted: lower fees, reasonable rules, and a community built on trust rather than intimidation. And Daniel? He didn't seek revenge in the form of personal gain. Instead, he used his settlement to rebuild, not just for himself, but for everyone. He donated part of the damages to establish a legal fund for homeowners wronged by abusive HOAs. He partnered with local attorneys to create workshops teaching residents their rights, ensuring no one else would be blindsided the way he had been. And though he could have bought another yacht immediately, he chose instead to wait, to build something even greater.
Months later, the Marina held a celebration. Families gathered on the docks, children played freely, and neighbors shared food and laughter. At the center of it all, Daniel stood quietly, watching as the community healed. They had been fractured by fear, but now they were united by resilience. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. A new yacht, larger and more magnificent than the last, glided into the marina. The crowd erupted in cheers as Daniel's vessel docked in the very slip where his old one had been destroyed. This time, there were no orange stickers, no threats, no hostile stares from a power-hungry board. Just applause, pride, and the sound of waves lapping against the hull. For Daniel, the yacht wasn't just a replacement. It was a symbol, proof that no matter how much power an HOA thought it had, it could never sink the spirit of someone who refused to be controlled. As the sun set over the water, casting golden light across the marina, Daniel stood at the bow, looking out at the horizon. He had lost much, but he had gained something priceless: the respect of his neighbors, the security of justice, and the satisfaction of knowing he had turned his pain into power. The HOA had tried to break him. Instead, they had built him into something stronger. And the message echoed far beyond the marina. Power without accountability will always collapse, and those who fight for what's right will always rise again.